for braving the chilly, still chilly spring weather here on the West Side Highway. We're getting together here tonight to talk about Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, continuous radicalization, and we're lucky to have Steve Ellner with us. Steve Ellner has been a professor at the Universidad de Oriente in Puerto La Cruz, Venezuela, since 1977, and is also teaching in the government's university-based Sucre Mission. Mission Sucre. And this semester, we're lucky enough to have him back in New York City. He's teaching over at Columbia University, and he's the author of several books and articles, but most recently, he's the author of Rethinking Venezuelan Politics, Class, Conflict, and the Chavez Phenomenon, which came out in 2008. So please help me in welcoming Steve Ellner.
Okay, one of the striking and really interesting aspects of the phenomenon of Hugo Chavez is the ongoing process of change in Venezuela, constant deepening of the process of change. Let me get my notes together here. And it makes the Venezuelan case different, to a certain extent unique. Because if you compare the Venezuelan case with other revolutionary processes, historically, going back to the French Revolution, there's really no similar case in which, over such an extended period of time, we're talking of over 12 years, there's this ongoing process of constant radicalization, constant conflict, deepening of the process of change, and polarization. Now, if you compare the Venezuelan case with, for instance, the French Revolution, there was a much shorter time span. And then, after 5-6 years of the Girondin and Jacobin stages, the Thermidorian reaction set in. The case of the Mexican Revolution, beginning in 1911, there was a pendulum kind of process in which governments implemented important radical reforms, but then the pendulum swung back to the right, and it went back and forth several times, and then by 1940, after Cardenas, it just got stuck in a rightist position. It didn't go back to the left after that. So that's different. In the case of Cuba, where Castro came to power in 1959, and the radicalization was very intense, but it took place over a very, very short period of time. By 1961, Castro had called himself a communist, a Marxist-Leninist, and implemented socialism. So that you compare those three cases, or the case of the Soviet Union in 1917, with the case of Venezuela, in which Chavez comes to power really with moderate banners of political reform, not socio-economic reform so much, but during a period of time, the radicalization began to take in economic reform, anti-neoliberalism, and then by 2005, the Chavistas embraced socialism. But that process has continued to this very day. So I think that makes the Venezuelan case different and interesting. And I think it is one of the keys to Chavez's political success. Chavez has won. Firstly, the Chavez government has held a record number of elections Venezuela has never had so many elections, not only elections for public office at the municipal level, at the state level, for the Congress, which is the National Assembly, and 3 presidential elections, but also referenda, a recall election in 2004, and internal primaries, elections in which the Chavistas choose their candidates for office, choose their authorities in the Chavista political organizations, so that this is really outstanding for Venezuela. And Chavez has been, for the most part, successful in these elections. In 2006, for instance, he won with the highest percentage. He received 63%, which was the highest percentage of votes in a presidential election in modern Venezuelan history since 1958. And I think one of the explanations for these political successes, and the fact that Chavez has stayed in office for so long, I mean, it's been 12 years, and that really, in a democratic context, is not at all common. When you look at the United States, up until the 1950s, presidents didn't have term limits, and yet there was only one president who was elected more than twice, the case of Franklin Roosevelt, and he was in office more or less the same period of time that Chavez has been in office. So that you can say that the mere fact that Chavez has maintained popularity at over 50% over such an extended period of time, and in the context of such difficult and pressing problems, requires some kind of explanation. And the opposition has a ready-made explanation, which is that the oil money has enabled the government to basically buy out the poor people. But the fact of the matter is, although the oil money has certainly helped, but the fact of the matter is that the oil money is being used not to buy out people individually in a patronage or clientelistic kind of operation, but in the form of social programs, which I'm going to get into shortly. But I think that to explain the political success of Chavez, you have to go beyond economistic explanations that money has allowed Chavez to stay in office for so long, when in fact, very often in boom periods where there's a lot of oil income, the governing power is voted out of power because it creates, the oil money creates high expectations, disappointment, discontent, and then a vote in favor of the opposition party. And that's what happened, for instance, in the 1970s. During the oil boom period in the 1970s, the governing party was voted out of office, even though the government had at its disposal an incredible amount of income as a result of the tripling of the increase in oil prices by 300, 400% during that presidential period from 1973 to 1979. So it requires another explanation or another set of explanations. And I believe that one of the important factors that explains Chavez's political success is that Chavez and the Chavistas, I don't like to say Chavez. I try to avoid doing that because I really don't believe that this process is about Chavez. He's naturally an extremely important leader and he plays a fundamental role, but it's more than just Chavez. So I use the term Chavistas. The Chavistas have taken advantage of every triumph, every electoral triumph and non-electoral triumph, in order to push ahead the process of change, in order to take advantage of the so-called honeymoon effect. Everybody knows that any president who's elected has a certain time period time span, it could be a matter of weeks, it could be a matter of months, in which, having been elected, he or she enjoys a certain amount of popularity, and at the same time the opposition is demoralized. The Chavistas have taken advantage of those moments of success by immediately moving ahead and implementing more radical change, and change that favors the social sectors of the population, the non-privileged sectors of the population. Just momentarily compare that with Obama. You know, when Obama was elected president, you know, there were a few weeks there, maybe a few months, in which he had a golden opportunity to deliver blows at the Republicans. The Republicans were demoralized. They were really down in terms of public opinion surveys. And yet, he pushed this policy of consensus, goodwill, and as a result, he lost that opportunity. Maybe he didn't want the opportunity in the first place. But in any case, I just mentioned that to compare that with Chavez. Each time there's a victory, there's a deepening of the process of change. So let me go over this process, going back to 1998. When Chavez was elected in 1998, he was, during the electoral campaign, Chavez toned down his rhetoric and his program. For some of you who might not know, Chavez, up until 1992, was unknown among the vast majority of Venezuelans. He was a middle-level officer who, on February 4th, 1992, spearheaded a coup against the president, the neoliberal president, Carlos Andrés Pérez, and was considered, after that, somewhat of a firebrand. He went to jail as a result of the failed coup. When he was released 2 years later, he traveled to Cuba, was very well received by Fidel, even though the Cuban government had condemned the coup attempt 2 years before that. As I said before, Chavez was unknown, and people just assumed that the coup was a guerrilla-type coup coming from the right. The Communist Party of Venezuela said as much. I remember their presidential candidate, their ex-presidential candidate, said, "Look, if these guys had triumphed, they would have put us up against the wall and shot us." So there was not much known about Chavez at that point, and the coup was condemned by the Cuban government. But 2 years later, when Chavez was released from jail, he went to Cuba, was very well received. He was surprised by the reception. And so when Chavez participated in the presidential elections, beginning in 1997, for the elections that took place in December of 1998, he was considered, you know, a far leftist. In fact, prior to that, his organization was opposed to participation in elections. It was an abstentionist organization. It was practically, I think it was the only party at that point, the only leftist party that opposed participation in elections. So Chavez positioned himself on the far left of the political spectrum. But during those 2 years or year and a half of campaigning, Chavez toned down his rhetoric and his program, his position towards the United States, even though President Clinton denied Chavez a visa on 2 occasions, that he applied for a visa in order to travel to the United States to explain his position here in the United States, and that was denied by Clinton. And nevertheless, I remember distinctly that during that time, Chavez's attitude towards the United States, public attitude, his rhetoric, was very moderate. And for instance, there was some speculation about his position on the foreign debt. It was generally considered that he would implement a moratorium on payment of the foreign debt. And he modified that position, and he talked about different options, different possibilities, and a negotiated solution to the problem of the public debt. So that when he gets elected president in '98, his main banner was not really that radical. And the banner was the drafting of a new constitution. And that was really all about political reform more than socioeconomic change. The idea was that the old political structure didn't allow the people to participate, and Venezuelan democracy had been hijacked by a very small group of a political elite, specifically the leaders of the main political parties, pro-establishment political parties. And so the structure, the political structure had to change. One of the things that was proposed was a unicameral legislature and other reforms that would allow the people to participate in decision-making. I'm not trying to say that that was all that moderate. It really wasn't that moderate because what was established was the idea of a bottom-up kind of democracy. That's pretty radical. That's a pretty radical notion. And the Constitution that was drafted in 1999 embodied those arrangements in which social movements would participate in the nomination, in the selection of the Attorney General, the members of the Electoral Council, the judges of what was previously called the Supreme Court, the controller, so that it did involve creating mechanisms for participation in decision-making. That you can say, I would say, was radical, but radical on a political front, not on a socio-economic front. So that was the first stage. In fact, some people claimed, and I believe mistakenly so, but some of Chavez's adversaries in the labor movement said that Chavez was really a neoliberal, disguised as an anti-neoliberal. But since he didn't implement really progressive economic policies, and he did hold on to a key person, the Minister of the Treasury, the Hacienda in Spanish, from the last administration, who was connected with international finance, Maritza Izaguirre. Some of Chavez's adversaries said, look, Chavez is really pulling the wool over the eyes of the people. He's really a neoliberal, but he wasn't. And the proof of that was that from the very beginning, Chavez put a hold on privatization. There was massive privatization in the 1990s, or privatization of key sectors of the economy, and some of those sectors were in the process of being carried out. The privatization was in the process of being carried out, such as in the case of Social Security, electricity, aluminum was moving that direction. Attempts were made to privatize aluminum in 1998. And the oil industry, which was being privatized throughout the 1990s. And Chavez put that on hold. So in my mind, you couldn't say that Chavez was a neoliberal. He was progressive. But he wasn't on socioeconomic issues, he wasn't a radical. So that's the first stage. Chavez wins the elections for well, firstly, the elections, there were 3 elections that were held in 1999 for the Constitution. One to go ahead with the drafting of the Constitution, a second to nominate delegates to the Constituent Assembly, and then later on that year, in December of '99, to ratify the Constitution. And then new elections were held for all the offices at all the levels. Chavez was re-elected president, and so those triumphs in 1999 and 2000 strengthened Chavez politically. And like I said before, Chavez takes advantage of that momentum. and takes advantage of that popularity and takes advantage of the demoralization of the opposition. Because in 2000, Chavez wins the presidential elections again. He had been elected in 98 with 56% of the vote, and then in 2000, new elections were held as a result of the new constitution, and he wins with an even higher percentage, with 58%. And so he takes advantage by implementing reforms in 2001, which are anti-neoliberal reforms. And the most important of them all for Venezuela, being an oil-producing nation, was the organic hydrocarbon law, La Ley Orgánica de Hidrocarburos, which stipulated that all mixed companies involved in primary oil activity would be controlled by the state. In other words, that law put a halt to the gradual privatization of oil, which was taking place in the 1990s. In the 1990s, under two pro-neoliberal governments, and stated that more than 50% of the stock of all these mixed companies had to be controlled by the Venezuelan state oil company. And a land reform, which in the Venezuelan context explains everything, because historically, land reforms have been very dangerous. In 1945, the Minister of Agriculture implemented land reform, or passed land reform legislation, drafted land reform legislation. It was about to be implemented, and just weeks later, the government was overthrown in a military coup in 1945. 3 years later, the famous novelist Romo Gallegos, the president, who had been elected president with a very high percentage of the votes, did the same thing. A land reform that was passed, it was drafted, and was about to be implemented, and just a few weeks later, he was overthrown. And Chavez passed the law of the lands, La Ley de Tierras, along with the oil legislation that I just mentioned, and just 3 or 4 months later, he was overthrown in a military coup that took place in April of 2002. So that now the government is entering a stage which I consider, which I label an anti-neoliberal stage, in which economic reform is being promoted. Following the failed coup, which took place in April, in which Chavez was ousted for 2 days and then returned, and then a general strike, which was really a misnomer because it was a lockout. Workers didn't have any say-so. They showed up to work and the doors were closed. So whether the workers were supporting the strike or not was irrelevant. The company bosses closed the doors. But it was called a general strike. And that also failed, although it was a very difficult situation for Venezuelans, 2 months in which the oil production almost was reduced to zero. Venezuela had to import gasoline, or oil, imported hydrocarbons from Brazil. So that after that, there was a new momentum. And shortly after that, a recall election was held. The opposition got enough signatures for a recall election. Chavez won that with 60%. If you remember the statistics, 56% the first time, 58% the second time, and the recall 60%. So it's going up. And Chavez then takes advantage of that momentum of the recall election, and just 2 months after that, municipal elections, with the Chavistas won in almost all the municipalities, so that shortly following that, the land reform was applied to the private sector, not the state sector, not state property, but the private sector. And at the same time, Chavez redefined the concept of private property, in which he stated private property holders, have rights, but they also have obligations. And one obligation is that a company cannot just close down, it's got to continue to function, just like it's the obligation of landholders to produce up to 80% of capacity. Several companies were taken over, were expropriated, and turned over to the workers as a result of the fact that those companies had closed down. And at the same time, Chavez called himself a socialist, and the doctrine, the goal of the Chavista government was socialism. That was as of January of 2005. So that this has been an ongoing process. And just to take that up to the present, Chavez was re-elected president in December of 2006 with the highest percentage, as I said before, 63%, the highest percentage of votes in modern Venezuelan history since 1958. And that momentum translated itself into the nationalization of strategic sectors of the economy. Electricity was taken over. The electricity companies in some areas of the country were public to begin with, but in Caracas, it was U.S. Owned, Electricidad de Caracas, and in several other states, and they were nationalized. The telecommunications industry had been bought out by GTE, and then sold to Verizon in the 1990s. And in 2007, that was nationalized. And the oil industry was nationalized also. It had been nationalized, but the government exerted greater control and called this the renationalization of oil, which is really a misnomer. But what was, I mentioned before that 50% of the oil industry, of the oil mixed companies had to be state owned. Well, this increased it to 60%, and other legislation as well, which meant tighter state control of the oil industry. And then the following year, steel, which had been privatized in 1997, was nationalized from a Latin American consortium. And the cement company, which had always been private in Venezuela, but at that point was owned by Cemex, the Mexican company, that was also nationalized. So that's a new stage. And then more recently, we can talk about another stage, because what happened in 2007 and 2008 was the nationalization of strategic sectors of the economy. That program had always been supported theoretically by political parties in Venezuela. In the Constitution of 1961, the state is to maintain control of basic industry. That never happened completely. It happened in some sectors like steel. But this was at least not controversial in the sense that historically, even conservative parties have supported that. But following 2008, in the last few years, the government has gone beyond the nationalization of strategic sectors of the economy and has expropriated companies due to a variety of goals and objectives. And the most important is to combat scarcity, because the opposition and the private sector has created a problem of scarcity, undoubtedly for political reasons, but also perhaps for economic reasons. They say they don't have incentives to invest, but it's kind of strange that at a time when there's so much oil money in Venezuela and there's so much consumption power in Venezuela that the production doesn't keep pace with that demand, and there is scarcity. And the scarcity is usually at key moments right before elections. So that what the government has attempted to do is to achieve what the Chavistas call food sovereignty, which means that the country itself is able to produce, not depend on foreign imports. But at the same time, what it's meant in practice is that the country doesn't have to depend on local production either on the part of the private sector. And so, just to give you one example of this kind of expropriation, there was a terrible scarcity of milk leading up to the referendum in the year 2008, which was the first time the Chavistas were defeated. It was a proposal of the Chavistas to reform the Constitution. There were 69 articles of the Constitution that were going to be reformed, and it was narrowly defeated. And one of the reasons why it was defeated was that during the months prior to the elections, milk practically disappeared completely from the grocery stores and the supermarkets. And following that, at that time, the Chavista government nationalized, expropriated Lácteos Los Andes, which is a milk company. And now that problem of scarcity has been overcome almost completely. The skim milk or reduced fat milk, which is what I consume, was very, very difficult to get in the year 2008. And now it's relatively easy to get. And regular milk, whole milk, you can get practically any place. So that this is one example, but also coffee, sardines. Cargill was a rice factory, rice processing company owned by Cargill was expropriated. And so that the Chavistas have expropriated in order to achieve that objective. And I think that what is important about this process from a political viewpoint is that in a situation of difficulty, of an economic downturn, partly a result of the world economic crisis, but not completely, because there's also problems of government inefficiency, corruption, and a situation in which people over a period of time say, look, you know, I voted for Chavez, I supported Chavez, but now I have misgivings. And part of the reason for that is just an erosion of enthusiasm. As I mentioned before, you know, 12 years is a long time for any president. And, you know, as I mentioned before, the case of Roosevelt was the only example in U.S. history in which a president was in power for so long. But he was, the latter part of Roosevelt's presidency coincided with the Second World War. Who knows what would have happened following the Second World War with regard to Roosevelt. So this erosion of enthusiasm is to a certain extent natural. And what this process of the constant deepening of change means politically is that the government and the Chavista movement can say to the rank and file Chavistas, look, there are difficulties and there are problems of corruption and inefficiency, but this process is not stagnated. It hasn't stagnated. It's a continuous kind of process, and the process is responding to the needs of the people. And so I think that this shoots adrenaline in the veins of the people in general, the popular classes in general, at a difficult moment. A year ago, there was a terrible problem of electricity, rationing and blackouts as a result of a dry spell. The opposition attributed to government incompetence, and that's the opposition's line, that everything that goes wrong is due to government incompetence. The fact of the matter is that there was a dry spell that didn't have any precedent in Venezuelan history for about 50 years or so, and that had everything to do with the problem of rationing. But the rationing itself wasn't well administered. You know, it was supposed to rationing was supposed to take place 2 hours every other day, but sometimes it was more than 2 hours, or very often it wasn't every 2 days, it was on different days, so people couldn't anticipate the rationing. And so there was a problem. Inefficiency was part of the problem, but the opposition exaggerated and at the same time refused to recognize that the dry spell had a lot to do with the problem. But I think that in the context of these very difficult problems, the constant process of the deepening of change, the intensification of conflict, has been the key to Chavez's political success. Okay. In addition to, you know, when I began discussing this process of change, I compared the Venezuelan case to other historical experiences of revolutionary change. I mentioned the French Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Mexican Revolution. Some of them were socialist, others were not socialist, but revolutionary. And I said that the Venezuelan case was fairly unique in that sense. And I believe that the Venezuelan case is unique in another way as well, which I'd like to discuss now. And that is that if you compare the Venezuelan case of these 12 years with social democratic governments that also move in the direction of socialism in Europe, in Africa, and you compare Venezuela with socialist experiences such as Cuba, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China, I think there are fundamental differences in both cases. With regard to the social democratic governments that talked about socialism, that brought about some steps in the direction of socialism, there wasn't the intense polarization that characterizes Venezuela during these 12 years. The Social Democrats in power had their adversaries. They were eventually voted out of power. But you didn't have a situation of such intense polarization. The opposition is a disloyal opposition. It opposes everything that Chavez says and does. The term disloyal opposition refers to an opposition that goes beyond mere criticism and questions the legitimacy of the government. In other words, questions the government's right to exist, even though in this case the government has been elected, it's an elected government, but nevertheless, if an opposition considers that everything that an elected government does is wrong, if the government isn't getting anything right, and in addition to that, the opposition says that the government is moving or has the intention of moving in an authoritarian direction and that shortly Venezuela will be converted into a dictatorship, naturally the opposition is saying that the government should be removed. Even though it is not engaged in violence necessarily, and even though it's playing by the electoral rules of the game, nevertheless it is a disloyal opposition. And that gives you some idea of the intense polarization that exists in Venezuela. In fact, in Venezuela, for better or worse, and I'd say for worse, there really isn't any middle ground at the national level. There is the opposition that groups different parties, but at this point, in my mind, the parties don't really differentiate themselves, even though behind each party there are certain positions, but you know, you listen to the parties, you read what they say, and even in internal discussion, or at least the kind of internal discussion that people might be able to access, there's no real feeling that there are any differences. The opposition is anti-Chavez. And then there are the Chavistas. But there's no middle ground. There's no party, for instance, that runs against the Chavistas in elections, but might support some of the Chavez program, might vote for some of the Chavista legislation in Congress, for instance.